The man put his hand on Dean Martin, on live television, in front of 40 million people. He should not have done that. Nobody touched Dean Martin on a stage. Nobody had ever tried. Clint Eastwood's man tried. Once. One man made a move he could not take back. One man watched it happen from 6 feet away. And one man turned, not to the bodyguard, to Clint, and said one sentence. And that was the end of it. What happened on Johnny Carson's Tonight Show that night did not just embarrass one of Hollywood's rising stars. It showed everyone in that studio exactly what happens when you send someone else to do something you should have handled yourself. NBC Studios, New York, 1964. The Tonight Show, the most powerful stage in America, not because of the size of it, because of who watched it. 40 million people. 5 nights a week. What happened on that stage happened in front of everyone. And what happened there on a Thursday night in November happened in front of all of them. With no warning. With no plan. With no one in that building anticipating that those particular 30 seconds were coming. Dean Martin was 47 years old. The Sands. The Rat Pack. The Top. A man who had never needed protection on any stage, because no stage had ever threatened him. He walked into rooms, and the rooms reorganized themselves. Not because he asked them to, because that was what rooms did around Dean Martin. They had been doing it for 20 years. He had stopped noticing. Not out of arrogance, because it had become as natural as air. Clint Eastwood was 34, just back from Italy. Sergio Leone, A Fistful of Dollars, the man who was becoming the new face of American tough. The squint, the silence, the economy of movement. A man the world was beginning to take seriously. Who was about to learn what serious actually looked like? Not on a film set, not with a script, in a backstage corridor. In 30 seconds, before the cameras went on, the bodyguard had no name that anyone recorded. He was a large man, Clint's man, who made one decision that Thursday night, the kind that defines a night nobody planned for it to define. He was doing his job. He had always done his job. He simply did not understand the particular geometry of the room he was working in. He found out. Johnny Carson sat behind his desk. He saw everything on that stage. He said nothing that night. Because by the time Dean was done, there was nothing left to say. You know that moment when someone does something on your behalf that you did not ask for. And it goes wrong. And now you have to stand there and own something you never chose. That is exactly where Clint Eastwood was. Thursday night, November 1964, NBC Studios, New York. The Tonight Show preparing to go live. Everything the way it always was, except the guest list. The studio was warm. The audience dressed up. Carson behind his desk running through his notes. The band loose and easy. The kind of night that looks simple from the outside and never is. Clint Eastwood had arrived with people. That was normal for where he was going in his career. The entourage, the security, the infrastructure that builds up around a man when the world starts paying that kind of attention. But the Tonight Show stage was not a large stage, and there were already people on it. The backstage area was tight. 2 major guests. 1 show. Clint's people were organizing his side. Dean's people were on the other. The kind of logistics that usually works itself out. Usually. That night it did not work itself out. Backstage on The Tonight Show was a particular kind of organized chaos. Cables on the floor, crew moving in every direction, the band warming up behind a thin wall, makeup chairs, coffee cups, guest handlers. All of it compressed into a space that was never designed for 2 stars of this size. Dean Martin had been backstage on this show before. Many times. He knew where the good coffee was. He knew which crew member to talk to if you wanted to know how the audience was running. He knew the feel of the place. This was not a new room to Dean Martin. It was almost a second home. Clint Eastwood was newer to this particular stage. His career had been building fast. The westerns, Leone, the squint that America was starting to recognize. He was on his way. Everyone in that building knew it. But knowing you are on your way and knowing the room are two different things. Clint knew the first. Dean knew the second. Dean Martin stood at the edge of the stage, relaxed, coffee in hand, talking to one of the crew. He was not paying attention to Clint's side. He did not need to. He had been on this stage before. He knew exactly where he stood. And then someone moved. Clint's bodyguard crossed the line. Not dramatically, not with intention, just a man doing his job. Clearing space, moving people, making room for the man he worked for. He put his hand on Dean Martin's arm. To move him. The way you move furniture. The way you move something that does not have a say. Here is what nobody ever talks about. Clint Eastwood did not send that man to touch Dean Martin. He sent him to organize the space. But when you send a man to do something without telling him exactly where the lines are, you own everything he does. Clint was about to learn that. Now see it from the bodyguard side. He was doing his job. He did not know Dean Martin personally. He knew the name, the face, the songs. But in that moment, Dean Martin was just a man standing in a space his employer needed. He did not understand what he was touching. He found out. What did Dean Martin do in that first second? Nothing. And that nothing was the first sign. 3 men in that corner of the stage. The bodyguard, Dean. Clint 6 feet back. Only one of them understood what was about to happen. It was not the bodyguard. It was not Clint. The crew was watching. Not all of them. The ones who were close enough, the ones who saw what was on Dean Martin's face. Or rather what was not on it. No anger. No surprise. No reaction of any kind. Just Dean Martin, looking at Clint Eastwood, as if the bodyguard were not there at all. Why did Dean ignore the bodyguard completely? What does it mean when a man is touched and does not address the hand? Addresses the man behind it instead? What does that move say about how Dean Martin understood power? And what did it say to Clint Eastwood in that moment? The answer was in what came next. Something tightened in that corner of the stage. The crew member Dean had been talking to stop talking. Clint's side went quiet. The bodyguard's hand was still on Dean's arm, and Dean Martin had not moved, had not looked at it, had not acknowledged it in any way. He was looking at Clint, calm, still, patient. The way you look at someone when you have already decided what you are going to say, and you are giving them one last moment before you say it. There are men who respond to an intrusion by addressing the intrusion, and there are men who respond by addressing the source. The first kind wins the moment. The second kind wins the room. Dean Martin had never cared about moments. He cared about rooms. Was Clint capable of responding to what was coming? Or had Dean already made that impossible before he opened his mouth? That was the question everyone in that corner was about to have answered. Carson was at his desk. He could not see the corner from where he sat, but he could see the crew. And the crew had gone a particular kind of still. The kind that meant something was happening. Carson made a note to himself. He would watch when they came out. He always watched. Here is the thing about Dean Martin that nobody in that corner fully understood. He had grown up poor. Steubenville, Ohio. Steel town. A family with not enough of most things. He had worked bad rooms. Small rooms. Rooms where nobody cared who you were, and you had to make them care. He had done that for years before anyone knew his name. And in those years he had learned something that a man cannot learn any other way. He had learned that rooms do not give themselves to you. You earn them. One night at a time, one decision at a time, one sentence at a time. By the time he walked onto the night show stage in 1964, Dean Martin had earned more rooms than most people would ever see, and he knew it. Not with arrogance, with the quiet certainty of a man who has done the work. The Bodyguard did not know that. Clint Eastwood was still learning it. Dean Martin was about to give him a tutorial, free of charge, in 30 seconds, before the cameras went on. That moment, the Bodyguard's hand on Dean's arm. Dean not moving, Clint 6 feet away. Carson at his desk, the audience not yet aware, the camera rolling. The Bodyguard's hand was still there. Dean had not looked at it. Dean had not looked at the Bodyguard. Dean was looking at Clint. Clint had not moved. Nobody had moved. 40 million people about to watch. A man whose hand was on Dean Martin, a rising star who could not pull his man back fast enough to stop what was coming. And Dean Martin, who had already decided, before anyone else in that corner understood there was a decision to be made. Dean Martin did not raise his voice. He did not look at the hand on his arm. He looked at Clint Eastwood, the way you look at the person who is responsible, not the instrument, the source. And then he spoke. Clint Eastwood's man had his hand on Dean Martin, on a live stage, in front of 40 million people. Most men would have addressed the Bodyguard, made it physical, made it loud, made it a scene, but Dean Martin was now at most men. He did not look at the Bodyguard. He looked at Clint. And what he said, in the next 5 seconds, made sure that hand was never going to be a problem again. If stories like this are the kind that stay with you, subscribe. We find the moments that history almost forgot. What Dean said next changed everything in that studio. Dean Martin looked at Clint Eastwood. Not at the Bodyguard. Not at Carson. Not at the audience. At Clint, the man responsible, the man who needed to understand what had just happened. He smiled. That smile. The one that said he had already won and was giving Clint the chance to figure that out for himself. And then he spoke. Quiet enough that only the people closest heard it. Loud enough that every one of them remembered it for the rest of their lives. He said, "In this room, your man works for me too. Nothing else. No explanation. No threat. No anger. Just that," said to Clint. As if the Bodyguard was not standing right there. As if the Bodyguard had already ceased to be relevant. Which, in that moment, he had. Let that sentence sit for a second. In this room, your man works for me too. It was not a threat. It was not a boast. It was a statement of fact. About what this room was. About who had built it. About who had been coming here long before Clint Eastwood arrived. And who would be here long after. It said all of that. In one sentence. Without saying any of it out loud. That was the craft of it. That was why it worked. The Bodyguard's hand came off Dean's arm. Not dramatically. Just gone. The way a hand comes off something when the person it belongs to suddenly understands what they are touching. Clint Eastwood did not respond. He could not, because the sentence had not left him room. It was not an insult he could answer. It was not a challenge he could accept. It was a fact, stated simply, by a man who believed it completely. And when someone states a fact that calmly, with that much certainty, in front of that many people, the only move left is to accept it, or look like you cannot. Clint accepted it, in silence, the only way he could. The crew who had seen it exchanged no looks, no raised eyebrows, nothing that would draw attention to what had happened. That was the thing about moments like this. They did not need commentary. They were complete on their own. The sentence had done something particular to the room. It had redrawn the map. Without anyone moving a step, the Bodyguard was in a different place than he had been 30 seconds ago. Not physically, In every other way that mattered, Clint was in a different place, and Dean Martin was exactly where he had always been. Which was the point. Which had always been the point. Dean Martin turned, walked back to where he had been standing, resumed his conversation with the crew member, as if he had stepped away to look at something mildly interesting and had now returned. His coffee was still warm. He drank it. You know that moment when someone says something that is so completely true and so completely calm that arguing with it would only prove their point. Where the only dignified response is silence. That is where Clint Eastwood was, standing 6 feet from Dean Martin, on a live stage, in front of 40 million people. With nowhere to go, Dean Martin had said one sentence. The bodyguard had stepped back. Clint Eastwood had said nothing. But that was not the end of the story, because what happened when those cameras went live 30 seconds later was something nobody planned for. And what Clint Eastwood did after the show revealed something about both men that the broadcast never captured. One sentence, said to Clint. Not the bodyguard. The room understood immediately. But the story did not end there. What happened when those cameras went live was stranger than anyone expected. And what Clint did after changed how both men were seen forever. Stay with it. Carson called the show to order. The way Carson always called things to order. Smooth. Professional. Like nothing had happened. But his eyes had seen everything, and Carson's eyes never forgot. The show went live. Dean walked to the couch. Clint walked to the couch. They sat 3 feet apart. Carson in the middle. 40 million people watching two men who had just established something in the 30 seconds before the cameras went on. The audience did not know what had happened, but they could feel it. The particular quality of two men who have already settled something sitting in the same space. An ease between them that did not come from warmth. That came from resolution, from a thing having been decided. The audience felt it without knowing what it was. Watch two men on a couch when one of them has already won something. The winner sits differently, not louder, not more expansive, just more settled, more finished, like a man who has already done the thing he came to do, and is now simply enjoying the evening. That was Dean Martin on that couch. Finished, comfortable, present. Clint Eastwood was professional that night. He was always professional. He answered Carson's questions. He laughed at the right moments. He gave the audience what they came for. But 3 feet away, Dean Martin was doing something different. He was doing nothing, in the way only Dean Martin could do nothing. Complete. Effortless. Like the couch had been waiting for him. Like the room was slightly warmer because he was in it. Like nothing that had happened 30 seconds before the cameras had registered anywhere inside him. That was the gap. That was where the real difference lived. Not in what had been said, in what it had cost each man to be in that room afterward. For Clint, something. For Dean, nothing. And that nothing was its own kind of statement. Carson asked Dean something. Dean answered. The audience laughed. Dean smiled. Not at the audience, not at Carson, just smiled. The smile of a man who finds the world generally amusing, and this particular evening no exception. Clint watched that smile. He had a good poker face. He did not let anything cross it, but he watched. Clint's people were quiet backstage. The bodyguard was not visible after the break. Nobody on Clint's side said anything about what had happened. The kind of quiet that means everyone knows and nobody is going to be the one to name it. Carson's producer caught his eye between segments. A look. The kind two professionals exchange when something has happened that neither of them is going to address on air. Carson gave a small nod and moved to the next question. That was Carson's gift. He could hold an entire incident inside a single nod. and keep the show moving. The show ran its time. Carson wrapped it the way he always wrapped it: warm, efficient, grateful. He thanked both guests. He thanked the audience. The band played them out. Dean Martin finished the show, talked to two members of the crew, laughed at something Carson said in the hallway, and left, like any other Thursday, because for Dean, it was any other Thursday. He had said the true thing, once, and he was done with it. Here is what nobody ever talks about. Clint Eastwood spent the drive home that night thinking about one sentence. Not what it meant about Dean, what it meant about himself. That he had sent someone into a space without understanding what that space was, without understanding who was already in it. That was the lesson, not Dean's sentence, his own mistake. There is a version of that night where the bodyguard never touches Dean, where Clint sees what his man is about to do and calls him back, where nothing happens, where 30 seconds before the cameras nobody has to say anything. That was the version Clint wished for on the drive home. He had not gotten that version. He had gotten the other one, the one with one sentence, and a hand that came off an arm, and a man who had not even looked at the hand. That was the version he was going to carry. The crew talked backstage, in small clusters, not about what Dean had said, about how he had said it, the calm of it, the precision, the fact that the whole thing had taken 5 seconds. One sentence, 5 seconds, and the entire room had understood. That was the part nobody could stop turning over. One of the crew members described it to someone the next day. He said the strangest part was not the sentence. The strangest part was what Dean did after. He turned around. He went back to his coffee. He resumed his conversation, as if he had stepped away to check something of minor interest, and had found it mildly interesting, and had now returned. That capacity, to say the necessary thing and then immediately move on, to treat the whole exchange as a small item in an otherwise ordinary evening. That was what people could not stop talking about. Not the sentence, the ease after it, the absence of anything that needed to be carried forward. Some things leave a mark on the person who does them. You can see it afterward, in how they hold themselves, in the particular weight of a thing recently said. Dean Martin showed none of that, because it had cost him nothing. It had simply been true. And true things do not cost the person who says them, not if they are already at peace with what is true. After that night, something changed in how Clint Eastwood moved through rooms. Not dramatically. A calibration, the kind that happens when a man learns something he cannot unlearn. When Dean Martin's name came up in interviews over the years, Clint always found something careful to say. Respectful. Measured. The words of a man who remembered what it felt like to be on the wrong side of something he could not argue his way out of. People who worked with Clint in the years after that night noticed something. He became more careful about who he put in rooms, more careful about what he asked people to do on his behalf, more careful about the gap between his intention and someone else's execution. One sentence on a Thursday night in 1964 had done that. Not because Dean had humiliated him. Dean had not humiliated him. Dean had shown him something. Quietly. Once. Without malice. The way a teacher shows a student something they could not have found on their own. Clint was 34 years old that night. He was a fast learner. The lesson stayed. The lesson was not about Dean Martin. It was about what it means to send someone into a room on your behalf. What it means to let someone else carry your authority. And what happens when that person does not understand the weight of what they are carrying, or the weight of who they are carrying it past. Clint Eastwood became famous for doing things himself, for being in the room, for being the one at the front. Most people who knew him attributed this to his personality, to his particular kind of self-reliance. They were not wrong, but some of that self-reliance had a Thursday night attached to it. A specific Thursday, in November, in 1964. Dean Martin never mentioned that night in any interview. Not once. When Clint's name came up, Dean said what he always said about people he respected. Something warm, something brief, and moved on. The sentence had been said. That was enough. That had always been enough for Dean Martin. He did not need the story to keep being told. He had lived it. It was done. Clint Eastwood went on to become one of the most powerful figures in the history of Hollywood. Dean Martin went on to become a legend. Neither of them ever spoke about that Thursday night publicly, but the people who were in that studio talked about it for decades. The sentence, the smile, the hand coming off the arm, the 30 seconds that nobody planned for. Some of them described it the same way every time. The hand on the arm, the stillness, the look at Clint instead of the bodyguard, the smile before the sentence, and then the sentence, and then nothing, as if the whole thing had been a small interruption in an otherwise ordinary evening. That description, a small interruption, that was the thing that stayed, because for Dean Martin that is all it had been. A small interruption, handled, filed away, finished. For Clint Eastwood it had been something else entirely. And that difference between them, that gap in what it cost each man, was the whole story. This is not a story about a confrontation. There was no confrontation. That was the whole point. This is a story about what real authority looks like when it does not need to raise its voice. Clint Eastwood was becoming the face of a new kind of tough. The man who walked into rooms and took them. The man who did not ask, who did not need to. Dean Martin was something older than that. Something that did not need to take rooms, because the rooms already belonged to him before he walked in. Clint confused those two things that night. He sent someone to take a space that had never been available to take. Think about someone you sent to handle something for you, and it went wrong, and you had to stand there and own the consequences of a decision that was yours, even though the action was someone else's. Now think about the person on the other side of that moment, who did not address your representative, who looked straight at you, because they understood that you were the one who mattered. That is what Dean Martin did. That is what made it permanent. Authority is not the size of the people around you. It is not the number of people who work for you. It is not the space you can clear. Authority is what the room already knows about you before you open your mouth. Dean Martin had that. He had always had it. One sentence proved it to everyone who needed proof. We live in a world that mistakes infrastructure for power. The entourage, the security, the people who clear the path. Dean Martin showed us something different that night, that the most powerful man in the room is often the one who came alone, who needs nothing cleared, who the room reorganizes itself around without being asked. The next time you are tempted to send someone else to handle something that is yours to handle, remember that Thursday night. Remember what it cost. Remember the sentence, the smile, the hand coming off the arm. Some things you have to stand in yourself. Dean Martin knew that. He had always known that. NBC Studios, New York, 1964. A bodyguard put his hand on Dean Martin. Dean did not look at the bodyguard. He looked at Clint Eastwood and said one sentence. The hand came off. Clint said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. Dean Martin walked to the couch, sat down, and acted like Thursday was Thursday. Because for him, it was. That was Dean Martin, not the stage, not the songs, not the smile. This one sentence, said once, to the right person, at the right moment. If stories like this are what you come here for, subscribe. The playlist is waiting. These are the stories that matter. One stage, one hand, one sentence, 30 seconds that nobody planned for, that nobody forgot. Nobody had ever done that to Clint Eastwood. Not like that. Not with one sentence, not while smiling. Not while making it clear that the sentence was the end of the conversation before the conversation had a chance to begin. Think about what that requires, to have a man's hand on your arm, in front of people, on a live stage, and to not address the hand, to not address the man it belongs to look past both of them, to the source, to speak once, and then walk away. That is not anger management. That is not restraint. That is complete security. The security of a man who knows what he is, so fully, so completely, that nothing anyone does can shift it. Not a hand on an arm, not a bodyguard doing his job, not a rising star who has not yet learned the map of the room. Dean Martin walked off that stage the same way he walked onto every stage. Like the room had been waiting for him. Like nothing that happened in it could change what he already knew about himself. The bodyguard was gone. Clint was quiet. Carson was moving to the next segment. And Dean Martin was thinking about dinner. That was the thing about Dean Martin. He did not carry these moments. He put them down, the way you put down something that has served its purpose. The sentence had been said. The thing had been handled. And now it was done. And Dean was already somewhere else. Already on to the next thing. Already finished with it. That complete release. That was its own kind of mastery. The most powerful thing in any room is the person who needs the room least. Dean Martin was always that person. He never had to say so. One Thursday night in 1964, he proved it. That was Dean Martin. One sentence. That was enough.